I spent 3 months backpacking in Ireland and I spent $6,606. Let's talk about it. So, before I get into the nitty gritty, one small point to make clear is that I was only backpacking in Ireland. I wasn't doing the classic backpack around Europe, I was just in Ireland. And Ireland is like crazy expensive right now. There's a lot of factors that go into it, but there's like a housing crisis, just the cost of living has skyrocketed. I was comparing it to how expensive it is to live in a lot of other European countries, and it's up there. Like, it's crazy. Dublin is the seventh most expensive city to live in Europe right now. Of the other six in front of it, all of them are in Switzerland except for London. So if you've ever been to Switzerland, that gives you an idea of how expensive Dublin is. Dublin is more expensive than Paris, than Luxembourg, than Manchester, etc. Anyway, yes, so I spent a lot of money and we're gonna go through it. So I have graphs off to the side, so if I'm looking over there, that's what it's about. But for September, I spent $2,039. Now, this one was really expensive for a couple of reasons. The main one being I had a round trip flight, so I flew to Ireland at the end of September and then I was flying back home for Christmas in December. So I bought that whole round trip flight and just put it in September, which I guess isn't really fair because I was only taking half of that flight over, but nuances. I also had to buy a backpack. So, other than those two things, most of my expenses came from living, like hostels, which is kind of weird because I was literally only in Ireland for less than 2 weeks in September, and it was still a third of my budget. So that gives you an idea of the housing crisis. For October, I did better. I spent $1,702. For this one, housing was most of it. We were struggling. Hostels were expensive. Airbnbs were expensive. It was rough. It was $997. I basically spent $1,000 on housing. Now, considering my rent is 800 euros, so about $900 currently, I guess $1,000 isn't bad with constant travel, but it is pretty rough for hostels. The rest of that month was pretty standard, I would say. We've got food, we've got transportation. Food was a little under $200. Transportation was $132. One weird one that probably other backpackers aren't going to have is what I called materials. That's in purple on this pie chart. And that's things like yarn for my knitting project and pretty much just yarn, to be honest. So I have like yarn and then club requirements, and so not to get into too much detail, but the reason I was backpacking around was doing knitting stuff in Ireland, and so I was joining a lot of knitting clubs, and you'd have to buy stuff often, like you'd be meeting in a pub, so they're like, okay, you gotta buy a tea or a beer or whatever. So that I was counting as like a requirement, and then also materials I needed to buy yarn and stuff for what I was doing. However, I wasn't doing that much touristy stuff, and if you're like actually backpacking around, I'm gonna guess you're gonna be spending more on that. November, I did better, even better than the previous month. I spent $1,355. Half of it was on accommodation, almost $700 on accommodation. A quarter on food. To be honest, I don't know why food was so expensive in November. Like, it was $355. It almost doubled from the previous month. I was staying in more remote places, so food was more expensive. I was in Donegal, I was on the Aran Islands. The food was definitely more expensive, but I don't think it was that much more expensive. So I don't know there. December, I finally got closer to breaking even. I spent $1,508. Again, a lot of it was on housing, although really not that much for this month. It was $365 was on housing, and then most of it was on transportation, $866. And this was because I had another flight to buy. I was coming back to Ireland in January and then leaving again in June, so I bought that round trip flight in December. I mean, it's kind of unusual, but There you go. December, again, I was not in the country for all of December. I left maybe around December 10th. So that's why housing was so minimal, was that I was not paying for 30 days of housing. So overall, my total spending, I already said, was the $6,606. 41.5% of that went to accommodation. So Airbnbs, hostels, pretty much just those two things. 28.8% was transportation, so that was mostly those two flights, but I also took a lot of buses and trains because I went to like 19 different places in Ireland. 10% of that was on food, so about $600 over the course of 3 months. I guess that's pretty normal. That's not, I mean, that's a little expensive for one person, but that's not horrible. Another 10% was spent on materials. Again, I think if you're doing a classic backpacking trip, this would be subbed out for like touristy things, so like tours and experiences and stuff. 5% was spent on other. This is just like random stuff that didn't have a place to go. This one's kind of sad. 2.3% was spent on fun. I wish I was spending more on fun, but I like didn't have money to spend on the necessities, so 1% was spent on club requirements. I think that's it. So that is how much I spent in 3 months backpacking around Ireland. Now, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the housing because that was the main expense that I was trying really hard to bring down. There wasn't much I could do about flights. Like I did pretty well, I feel like, getting a $700 round trip flight to the United States. So best I could do was housing. So I crunched some numbers with this. Let's go through it. And then I have some tips for spending less on housing as well as a few other categories. I was in Ireland for about 3 months. I was here for exactly 82 days. And I went to 19 different places. So like 19 different cities, towns, whatever. Places where I slept, not day trips. And a lot of those were duplicated, so I went to Dublin like 6 times. So I went to 12 unique places. On average, that means I spent 4.3 days in each location. And in some places, I had to get multiple accommodations, like I would have an Airbnb for half of it or 2 hostels or whatever. Because of the housing crisis, it's difficult to find somewhere to sleep in Ireland, tragically. So I went to 21 accommodations overall, which means I spent an average of 3.9 days in each accommodation. So I was switching beds basically every 4 days. The place I went to the most and spent the most time in was Dublin. I went there 6 times for a total of 18 days. That's a fair chunk of what of the time I spent here. And I was really hustling. Starting in October, I was trying to find free places to stay. 6 of the 19 places I went, I stayed for free. 19 days I got for free, and then I had to pay for 63 days. The total amount of money I spent on accommodation was $2,739. So if you divide that across the entire 82 days that I was in Ireland, that comes to an average of $33.41 per night, which isn't horrible for Europe. It's still a lot, but it's not horrible for Europe. But if you take out all those days that I got for free, to determine the actual average amount of money I was spending for places I was paying to sleep, it was $43.49 per night. So it was pretty expensive. However, luckily for you, I have some tips and tricks for finding free places to stay. So a few of the places I stayed for free were with people I knew or met along the way. For instance, there were these 2 girls that are also in my Fulbright program. They had a flat in Dublin, so I stayed with them for a couple of days. I don't really have any advice there other than that if you have friends in foreign countries, like, if they're good friends, they'll let you stay with them. Utilize your network, but don't be greedy. The biggest tip I have is Worldpackers and Workaway. I'll leave links down below. I don't know if they're affiliate links or not. I'll put it down there. But these are sites that you can sign up for. It does cost money for like a year-long subscription. But if you get one place to stay for free, it pays for itself. You can sign up and find hosts, and these are people living in places or whatever that will let you stay with them for free, and they will often provide food as well. And in return, you do chores. So it's about 20 hours a week is pretty usual. I mean, you can see it on the posting on the site. It will show you what they expect you to do and how much. But you can stay for all amounts of time. I mean, it could be just a few days, it could be a week, it could be a month, doing chores for them, and then you get room and board for free. So I did that. I only ended up doing it once. I was going to do it a second time, and then schedules changed on both of our ends, so it didn't happen. But I did it once with someone in Kinloch Thomas near Waterford. I have a vlog. I'll put it on the I button. But it was great. I mean, it was a lot of work while I was trying to do my Fulbright project full time and then also add on 20 hours of chores. Like, it was a lot. But I could totally see where if you were traveling and having fun, it's not that bad, and it's a really great way to get immersed into the culture because you're literally living with local families. And I mean, Rosemary, who's the woman I stayed with, she was great. She was like, okay, we're gonna make traditional Irish food for you. You are going to meet Irish people. You're going to get immersed into the community, which was good for my project. And I think would be great if you're traveling somewhere and want to immerse yourself in the culture. So that's the biggest tip. One other thing that's not a way to stay for free, but that is cheaper, is you can go on Airbnb, and the cheapest options are often rooms in people's houses. Now, I will admit, the first time I did this, I thought it was really sketchy. I was like, oh my god, what if they're a murderer and I'm just like paying them to stay in their house and then I get murdered? But I have done it so many times in so many different countries. Personally, I've never had a problem. I won't say that that's always the case. You should definitely vet these people before you're staying in their house. But I've had really good experiences. Again, you get immersed into the culture in the same sort of way. You are paying for accommodation, but it's often cheaper than other options. I did it a few times in Ireland because it was cheaper than the hostels, or there were just no hostels in the place I wanted to stay. And something else you can do with this is you can contact people on Airbnb directly, and then you can get a cheaper rate usually because Airbnb isn't taking their percentage. I personally would never do this if I hadn't stayed with them beforehand because I like the security of like Airbnb knows where I am, and like if I get murdered, there's evidence, you know? But if I stayed with somebody before and like got to know them or whatever, then I would totally contact them again to try and stay in their place. And then you also, like, they know you, you know them. It's a little bit more flexible with schedules and stuff. I mean, I love the calendar at Airbnb because you can see exactly if something is available or not. But if they know who you are, they can often work something out. One of the other places I stayed for free, I don't have advice on, but I felt like I would share my story in case it inspired somebody. I had a week-long internship at this woolen mill, and I asked my boss, essentially the person who I talked to get this. I asked her where to stay because it was in Toongraney, which is in the middle of nowhere in Ireland. There were no hostels, there were no Airbnbs. I think there was an inn like a few miles away. A few kilometers, excuse me, sorry. And I didn't have a car, so like I didn't know what to do, and I asked her about it, thinking like maybe she would have a couch that I could crash on or whatever. She basically got her neighbor to let me stay with him for free. Turns out he was on workaway as well. Somehow I didn't find their posting. Maybe it was down when I was looking or whatever. But I ended up staying with my boss's neighbor for free because I was interning with her. And I found that Ireland and some other countries have similar vibes to them. When you ask somebody like to help you out with this problem or something, they will be very friendly and they will help you figure out where to stay and what to do and whatever. And essentially the mantra I came out of this 3-month experience with was there's no harm in asking. Like, the worst they can say is no. I mean, sure, I suppose people could be weirded out. I've never experienced that. People are always like, you want somewhere to stay? Oh, I'm sure we can find you something. If there's no hostel, we'll figure something out. And that's worked out really well for me in this case. So, I mean, when in doubt, ask around. The locals always know tricks, whether it's somewhere to stay that's unlisted or they have a couch. Like, if you're traveling cheap, like, you probably already know this. All right, now for a couple of tips on cheaper food, although I didn't really do a great job with that, as you could see by how much I was spending. Obviously, the cheapest way to eat is to buy food at a grocery store and ideally cook it at your hostel or Airbnb or whatever. One tip here is definitely check that your hostel actually has a kitchen. I simply assumed they all did. They do not. The first one I arrived at did not have a kitchen. Definitely verify if that is your plan. Otherwise, I mean, you can buy ready-made stuff from a grocery store and it's still cheaper than going out to eat. But sometimes, you just want to make your own pasta. And then the other biggest tip I have is before you go anywhere rural, bring some food with you, like at least the essentials. When I went to the Aran Islands, I brought food with me over on the ferry, and that was totally worth it because food was so expensive there. Same with Donegal, I brought some food with me. It was expensive there. Also in rural areas, sometimes it's harder to get the food. At least I had a few experiences where I got somewhere too late, the grocery stores were closed, it was dark out, it would be a while to walk to a grocery store anyway. And I was like, okay, guess I'm eating a Cliff Bar for dinner, which is not ideal, I don't recommend. And something I hadn't noticed before this trip is that hostels often have a free food bin or section in the refrigerator, or both. And when people staying at hostels leave and have food left over, they will leave it in these bins or refrigerator sections, and then anybody can have it. I mean, it's great. I wouldn't rely on it, obviously, but it can definitely help to supplement your meals. Like somebody left a pepper one day, and I was like, ooh, that'll go well in my pasta. Or, I mean, somebody leaves pasta or rice or all kinds of stuff. And I mean, free food. Why not? And then, of course, when I left, I would leave stuff that I wasn't taking with me. I mean, give and take, pass it forward. For transportation, one thing that you should definitely look into before you go anywhere is if they have student discounts or there's other discounts. I mean, there's senior discounts usually, there's all kinds of discounts. There are often certain special things you have to do to get the discounts. For instance, in Ireland, to get a student discount, you have to go through this whole process to get a LEAP card, and it's not going to be worth it unless you're here for like a month or so. Sometimes all you have to do is show your student ID. Something else worth it is travel passes. So depending on how long you're in a place and how much you're planning on traveling, it could be worth it to get a multi-day travel pass that will let you go on the public transportation for free at no extra cost with that travel pass. There's also, for some transportations, there can be deals at certain times. For instance, I was in Switzerland one summer and they had this like night travel pass for young adults. And so you bought the travel pass and it was like half as much as a normal travel pass, but you could only take trains between 7 p.m. and 5 a.m. So that was great if you're going out at night or if you wanted to go somewhere for the weekend and take like a late train and come back on an early train or something, or take 2 late trains. Now, it's definitely not the most convenient if you're commuting somewhere, but it can definitely save you a buck if you're willing to work around it. I will say the public transportation in Ireland is very complicated, possibly worth doing an entire video on. In general, the buses are cheaper than the trains. Once you have a student or young adult pass, it often becomes comparable. So make of that what you will. And then the last little tip I have is for phone plans. I've tried a bunch of different things. Personally, I like using an eSIM that gives me data because then I can keep my home phone number so all my family and friends from back home can contact me on WhatsApp and stuff, and there's no weird complications. I've tried a few different SIM cards, I've tried international phone plans, everything either doesn't work or is expensive, but the eSIM is super convenient. It doesn't work on all phones though, so you should definitely check that. I use Airalo, I really like them, and I have a referral code for them that I'll put down below. It's really convenient because you can pick different lengths of time that you want the SIM for, and you can also pick different amounts of data, so depending on how much you use or don't use, like, it can be really cheap. I did use Holofly at first because that's the cheaper option for unlimited data, but then I looked at it and I was like, I'm not using enough data to justify how expensive this is. I think it was approximately $90 for 3 months of unlimited data, but I'm using the 1 month long Airlo Ireland eSIM, which is 3 gigabytes for $9. So we're looking at $27 or $90. I mean, 3 gigabytes doesn't sound like a lot. It's been plenty for me. I haven't used it up yet. I haven't even gotten close. And I mean, I use my phone a lot. I'm always lost. So Google Maps is on my phone 100% of the time. It is open and it is rolling. So there you have it. That's how much I spent backpacking in Ireland for 3 months. Looking back on it, that was too much money. Like, oh boy. The average cost per day was $80.56. That sounds like a lot. Half of that is housing if you don't take into account the free housing I got. And then when you count the 2 flights, like, we're already lost. Like, it's a lost cause. I will say travel is expensive, even if you like really travel hack it. I mean, okay, I'm not a travel hacker in terms of like using credit card points to pay for flights. That would have saved me so much money. I don't know how people do that. But in terms of like if you're getting free accommodation and whatnot, it's still expensive. But I think it's worth it in the long run because you learn so much and it really changes you as a person. So, would I do it again? No, because I've done it once. I've learned all I can from 3 months backpacking in Ireland. I was incredibly lucky in that I was working on an academic project during this time, and so a lot of my budget was covered by my Fulbright grant. I also had savings, and my wonderful, supportive parents helped me out. So I was really, really lucky. I can't imagine doing this like just from my bank account. Like, I simply couldn't. Let's be honest. I'd be staying everywhere for free. There'd be no other option. But I hope this helps. I hope specifically the little make travel cheaper hacks help somebody out. I know a lot of them are self-explanatory, but it really depends on how much you've traveled. I have some friends who would know all of this, and I have others who would know none of it. So I'm hoping this helps everyone in between. All right. Peace. I feel like I'm signing off of a Zoom call. I'm like, bye, guys. Except there's no one here. It's just me in the room alone. Okay, well, happy travels.